And now please welcome Stellwagen Bank Marine Sanctuary Superintendent Craig McDonald.
Thanks very much, Ken. As Ken mentioned, this is just one of the series of events in our 10th anniversary celebration. We have newsletters at the booth out there that explain, detail some of the others. We hope you'll pick one up. Also, the center article of the newsletter for this quarter talks about the sanctuary confirmation of the site of the Portland. If you'd like to get on the mailing list for this, it comes out quarterly. Just give us a contact, and we'll see that you're so connected. John Fish, who's your speaker this evening, I have the pleasure of introducing him. And by way of background, John's the director of the Historical Maritime Group of New England, and he's vice president of American Underwater Search and Survey Limited. Before I tell you a little more about him, I just want to tell you that the contribution he made to this effort on behalf of the sanctuary is huge. We were working along quite methodically, beginning to inventory and assess the submerged cultural resources within the sanctuary when he came forth and volunteered all of the information that he had gathered that was able to point us to, without any hesitation, to the site of the Portland. That's a very generous deed, given what you will hear tonight of how much effort he and his associates put into that effort. And I'd like, if you wouldn't mind, just ahead of time, just to thank you. I'd like you to thank him along with me for this very generous gesture. Great. And John is continuing to work with us. We're hoping to investigate at least 50 other possible shipwreck sites within the sanctuary over the next few years, and we look forward to continued collaboration with John and his associates. John grew up in New England and has been close to the sea all of his life. And in the early 1970s, he became a member of the National Association of Underwater Instructors, or NAUI, and spent thousands of hours underwater using many different types of diving equipment. In 1981, he was operations director for the NOAA Undersea Habitat Hydrolab in St. Croix in the U.S. Virgin Islands. Since that time, John and his associates have specialized in the use of subsea remote sensing systems, including sonar, magnetometry, remotely operated vehicles, and integrated navigation systems. He teaches advanced sonar survey techniques to commercial, Navy, and other government clients. And John and his colleagues have been instrumental in the discovery of hundreds of sunken ships, downed aircraft, and lost hazardous cargo around the world. He's also co-author of 2 educational textbooks on underwater imaging. So would you please welcome John as he presents the talk, the search for the steamer Portland. John?
Thank you very much, Dr. McDonald. I'm sure many of you know some things about the Portland and the Portland Gale, and I'd like to, before getting into the work that went towards locating her final resting site, review some of the aspects that made up the steamer Portland itself. She was built in 1889 and launched in October of that year. A lot of the specs list her as being launched in 1890, but really it was in the fall. It was said at the time that only the finest materials went into her. She was designed with 2 tiers of staterooms, all finished in cherry. There were a total number of berths of 514 on the vessel, so she could really carry quite a number of people, more than a modern 747 of today. She had a design with a shallow draft of 11 feet so that she could navigate up some of Maine's shallower rivers. You can see here that during the day of her launching, she didn't have her machinery or A-frame and walking beam installed. The boilers and her machinery were installed later in that year, and she was put into service in the spring. It was said in the newspapers at the time of her launching that the Portland Steam Packet Company had a fine vessel that would serve her well for many years. She would serve them for just over 8. She was an advanced vessel with Corinthian capped pilasters inside, and the salons were very plush, and she was one of the best appointed coasting steamers of the time. She was a successful steamer, and she plied the waters between Boston and Maine repeatedly. She was so successful, in fact, during these runs, that during these early years, that the company added a sister ship named the Bay State in 1895. It was just $1 to go from Boston to Portland on an overnight run. On the evening of November 26, 1898, the eve of the Portland gale, the Bay State remained in port due to an impending storm. In November of 1898, on that fateful night, the Portland steamed out of Boston with over 160 passengers, some estimates as high as 195, into a spitting snow. You can imagine the winds that we had today increased maybe by 10 or 20 miles an hour, and then imagine it with blowing snow, so visibility everywhere was just about 100 feet. It's interesting that Monday I heard the National Weather Service, as I turned on the marine weather, calling for 50-knot winds on Wednesday offshore, meaning, I think, Georges Bank in that area. But in 1898, they didn't have any radio forecast like that or weather forecast that would be as accurate as that. In a matter of hours after leaving the pier, the Portland would succumb to a bomb of a storm that would be her undoing. Since wires were down between Cape Cod and Boston, any news of the wreck was delayed. On Cape Cod, however, the life-saving service knew what had happened. The patrols worked back and forth between the life-saving stations to their halfway houses, and they knew that the steamer Portland had been lost. One report of people walking the beach, particularly a couple of days after the storm, said that the wreckage was so thick from the top hamper, or the upper decks of the Portland, that you could walk the beach to the south for miles without touching sand, walking just on the wreckage. All of it was from the Portland, and all of it was from the upper part of the Portland above the main deck. Finally, a telegram arrived in Boston. It's been said in recent years that the telegram went from Cape Cod to France and back, and well, it did, but the part of France that it went to was Saint-Pierre-Miquelon off of Newfoundland. So technically it went to France, but it didn't go that far, not to continental France. Word went back to New York and then up to Boston by telegraph that the Portland had met her fate. This is typical of just a small amount of the wreckage that was gathered and pulled up at a life-saving station for a photographer, but you can see that cabin doors are there, the name boards of the ship, and oars from life rafts all came ashore. If we jump ahead 3/4 of a century, in New England there were a group of ocean engineers who were divers, and they banded together, most all of them involved in the oceanographic industry and oceanographic sciences, and they all were divers, and they banded together to dive together. One of the most interesting aspects for this group, which I was one of, was diving on shipwrecks. It was a very fascinating thing. Also, underwater photography and videography, since many of us worked for companies that manufactured underwater camera systems, was a keen interest of ours. Exploring known shipwrecks in the region was a common activity on weekends. This was a hobby. It wasn't a commercial operation, and we spent lots of time exploring shipwrecks on the weekends with this hobby. After exploring all the known shipwrecks in a given region, there's always an interest in trying to find undiscovered shipwrecks. And we did that, and we used very basic equipment and some basic research before setting out. The equipment was crude. Before the advent of Loran C, or the Loran C units were so expensive that none of us could afford them, we used hand-bearing compasses to locate known wrecks and also to locate the positions where the life-saving records said undiscovered wrecks had been lost. But by far the most crucial activity that took place with the group was in the libraries. We spent far more time researching positions and researching historical records than we actually did on the ocean at sea searching. But the efforts were rewarded with a surprising number of discoveries in the 1970s. First dozens and then soon scores of shipwrecks that were previously undiscovered were pinpointed by the group and mapped. Working with a number of high-technology marine industrial firms such as Bob Ballard's MarQuest on Cape Cod, the divers were able to apply high-tech mapping technology and acoustically map some of the older wrecks discovered. Some of the team were very fortunate to work and learn from Dr. Harold Edgerton of MIT. Sometimes called Papa Flash, Doc had invented a number of inventions to his credit, including the electronic flash, which is used on almost every camera today. Doc was experienced in sonar, and he was keen on underwater exploration. He said, "Can I go out with you guys sometime? I'll bring my sonar." So we were pretty excited when he offered to help. Working with Doc was very helpful, and his equipment located wrecks on the seafloor faster than anything we'd ever seen. It could see large tracts of seabed in just simply one sweep. Instead of using an echo sounder that gave us just a single point along the bottom, we were able to look at 600 feet of seabed in one swath and spot anything that was sticking up off the bottom. By the late 1970s, the group had located over 200 previously undiscovered shipwrecks in New England waters. Remote sensing equipment and effective research was crucial to this successful hobby. The group began to attempt to locate some of the problem shipwrecks in the New England area. It took many more weekends at sea, much to the chagrin of most of our families. We also began to get requests from government agencies, the United States government, to help them locate some things. So we spent some time taking time off our work to assist the government in locating missing shipwrecks, aircraft parts, and that sort of thing. One of the more mysterious losses that we were interested, though, that never really left our mind, was that of the Portland. Captain Rufus Snow of Orleans, holding a wheel that is, I think, currently at the Centerville Historical Society, with a letter attached from the chief of the life-saving station at Highland Lights saying that it came ashore with the Portland wreckage. And it was determined to be the spare wheel. In case the main one broke, they had a spare one. We tried to find out where the Portland sank, and we tried to explore it. Very basic research showed that the night the Portland left Boston, she was seen at 7:30 or so, again at 9:30, as she headed up north. Now the wind, you can see, was north-northeast that night from about 4 p.m. until midnight when she left. After we actually discovered the final resting place of the Portland, it's my personal belief that Captain Hollis Blanchard was doing fine until he got out of the area, the protected area of Cape Ann, into the exposed sea that was coming down the coast. It was at that point that he realized he'd made a mistake. So the sightings there were at 9:30, 11, and 11:45, not much further away. But there was a questionable report of whistling heard off Highland Light. Some of the people said they heard the whistles. Other people said it was simply the wind in the wires. The wind was supposed to have blown to 90 knots in Provincetown before it blew the anemometer down. Well, the first place to look, of course, would be to try to eliminate any of the rumors and find out whether any of the stories of the whistles were true. We had another clue, too. In 1945, a local author claimed to put a diver on the Portland. And before he did, one of the local papers took quite a romantic view here, showing that the diver, of course it's cold underwater, the diver would open the cabin door and there would be all the passengers. And we know now that that's not the way things work underwater after a century or even a half a century. But also, very basic research does show that there was nothing left beyond the upper decks of the Portland. Well, this author put a plaque at Highland Light and actually gave us a position that the shipwreck was just simply 7 miles out to sea. So that helped us quite a bit in our early search operations looking for the shipwreck. We took a 12 square mile area and decided to search it for any shipwrecks or the Portland. And we spent an entire summer, weekends only, again, this is still a hobby, and we mapped out every single target in that region. We used remote sensing systems to image the bottom and to locate anything that was sticking up off the bottom. It resulted in quite a bit of data, which was reviewed and studied with each anomaly plotted as to where it was. We didn't find any large shipwrecks, but we did find one shipwreck. The largest timber on it was 185 feet long, and we decided to take a look at that optically. One of the team members is an expert at underwater photography, remotely triggered underwater photography, and we put a camera on that particular shipwreck. And we got a number of photographs, working from a fishing boat. The fishing captain had volunteered his time, so it didn't cost us too much money. The circles on these negatives are, or I guess they're positives in this picture, are bits of coal that a reviewer looked, and we were looking for different targets in this group that we had taken of this shipwreck. If I can get my pointer working here. There we go. The round cylinder here is a bottom-triggered trip weight. So when the camera was exactly 10 feet off the bottom, or however long our line was, it would trigger a spring-loaded switch, fire the flash, and open the shutter. Very basic, but it worked very well. This is broken shell with some coal, and this structure right here is a dragger door. This V is the bracket from a dragger door. And one of the fishermen that reviewed this said it looked like a Russian dragger door. I didn't know whether back then Russians had ever gotten that close. It's only a few miles offshore. But this is a dragger door, clearly had been lost on an obstruction. We looked at the other objects in the area, and the largest one we found was this main structure, which is wood, well worm-eaten, covered with anemones here, but it only stood up about 5 feet off the seabed. Again, everything was buried except 185 feet. We assumed, I think rightly so, that this was a coastal schooner, probably a 200-footer, maybe a four-masted schooner that had sunk in the 1800s. But there was nothing large at this site. This is a poor reproduction of a photograph of a shipwreck in the Straits of Magellan. Shipwreck's called the Olympian, and it was a paddle wheel steamer. And this is a man. So studying the proportions of this kind of wreckage, we knew that a wreck that stood 4 or 5 feet off the bottom would not represent the hull and machinery of the Portland. So in that square mile area, there were no wrecks that would represent the Portland. So we continued to search, and we expanded our search area, ever widening. We used, again, as a hobby with a low budget, we used vessels of opportunity, and manufacturers were very generous in loaning us remote sensing equipment that we could deploy and map the seabed off of Cape Cod. In the winter months, when we weren't offshore, the crew would spend many, many hours reviewing data that was gathered during the summer, looking for any telltale signs of wreckage. Over a 6-year period, we found dozens of shipwrecks. This area represents about 50 square miles, or maybe 75 square miles, but you can see where we went. We moved out in 79, back in close in 1890, 1980. 81 worked off here. There's very deep water here with very severe currents, but since there was no report of even a stick of wood from the Portland coming inside the bay, everything landed from here on out. It's a very, very close call here, because to have nothing come and you're only a half a mile away from a turning point in current flows, it was remarkable that nothing came from the inside. We worked down here, found a number of shipwrecks, possibly the Longfellow, which was carrying explosives and sank off of this region. We found a number of schooners up in here, but nothing the size of the Portland. At this point, we realized that the Portland was not close to Cape Cod. It sank further out to sea, which means that it didn't sink right at the time most of this flotsam had come ashore. We needed to do more research, and the most convenient place to get facts of things that came ashore and facts surrounding the loss of the Portland was newspapers. But we also knew that newspapers were not always correct. This was on the Sunday, the day that she sank, and it reports that she never left the harbor, but we know she did. So the group went and got 120 copies of newspapers from Boston, Portland, and Cape Cod over a span of 60 days. And we spent almost a year studying these newspapers, balancing one report from another, where one victim was a redhead but had initials on her ring, and someone else said she was a blonde with the same initials, trying to sort all of this out. and get the facts straight. A result of that research was a plot of all of the flotsam that came ashore on Cape Cod, where each one came ashore and what time it came ashore. This was crucial to really getting some basic research done from an oceanographic standpoint. The current was determined historically as to what the current was for certain times during that day in the evening. Any wreckage that was reported on the waterfront that made the newspapers of the 30s and 40s and 50s, we plotted these locations. A ship's bell was recovered here. I'm actually in possession of that bell. The fisherman gave it to me, and he said, "It's the Portland bell. It doesn't have any writing on it at all." It's probably just a bell from an old schooner. Crockery and fittings in the 30s, brass piping in 1926. And where the thickest wreckage came ashore and the first wreckage came ashore, 10 hours, 10 and a half hours. These things were the lightest, they had the greatest windage, and would be less susceptible to tides. We did this plotting, and we carried the plotting all the way down the Cape. On the outside, a description in the newspapers. This person was identified as Sykes. This Walton. There's one in here that has a key to stateroom number 34. And we did that all the way down, I think, to 180 hours after the suspected time of sinking. Bedding and flotsam at 32 hours. A ship's wheel that you saw in the earlier picture with Captain Snow came ashore 20 hours after it possibly could have sunk. One of the things that we felt was important, but we didn't know because there could be some doubt, were watches that were found. There were 4 watches discovered, and they were all stopped within 41 minutes of each other. We thought it was an important clue, but we couldn't be sure. One was stopped at 9:19, 2 at 10 o'clock, and 1 at 9:30. Did they stop from being immersed in water? Did they stop because the person fell down in a rolling ship in a bad storm? Or did they just become unwound? If you're in a really bad storm and you really fear for your life, do you wind your watch? Well, these days, with electronic watches, I wouldn't know whether you'd wind your watch. We took all of this data and all of the plots and all of the times and all of the types of debris, whether it was a heavy log or an ice house door or a body or an empty ice cream can, to Richard Lineburn at the Woods Hole Oceanographic. And Dick has an excellent, rock-solid reputation with us for hindcasting or predicting based on wind and currents where any given piece of flotsam was an hour ago, a day ago, or a week ago. We were asked to look for a helicopter that dropped out of sight between dropped off radar, between Block Island and Stonington, Connecticut. It had some young boys on it, pilots. And it just disappeared from radar. So we started a search, and we spent, I think, 3 weeks searching the area between Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Block Island. And then on Penakees Island, some 40 miles away, a piece of fiberglass was found on the beach, and it had a serial number on it, and it was traced to that helicopter. And Dick took the data, and he backtracked that piece of floating flotsam 29 days, 35 miles away. And the plot's interesting. The plot isn't just a straight line. The plot's circles, and then it goes this way, and then it goes back this way, depending on the wind and the tide. Dick put us within a mile of that helicopter. We had it on the first day. So Dick's good, and he's done that for us on a number of occasions with floating containers of cyanide offshore in the Pacific, and he's been very successful. Dick said, it's my estimate that 4 hours before the first things came ashore, they were located here. 6 hours before they were located here, 8 hours here, and they were located here 10 hours before she sank. We went to another good source, and that's the fishing community of New England. Fishermen are very, very knowledgeable about the texture and the type of bottom that they're working. Their lives depend on it, knowing where the fish are, where the obstructions are, and it's important to them. One of their most valuable assets is their nets. They take good care of their nets. If there are holes in their nets, their income goes right out that hole. If they lose their nets, they know where they lost them. And if they lose everything, a door, all the cable, and their whole net, it's quite a financial blow. The fisherman that gave us the hang or the obstruction that turned out to be the Portland told us he'd lost everything there. That wasn't the only location where someone had lost everything, but other ones say, well, I got a piece of wood, or I snagged for a little bit and it bumped. But on this particular obstruction that turned out to be the Portland, he had lost everything. So we'll just go and ask the fishermen for their hangs, and the 5 hangs they give us, it'll be easy. We'll have it done in a week. These are the hangs they gave us. And each one of these is described as a massive wooden shipwreck. There's only a few that are, but they thought they were big shipwrecks. This area, we'd taken care of the area down here, so we needed to march north. And since it's a hobby and we're paying for it out of our back pockets, we don't have the resources that we would have liked to, we decided to get a plan together where we only had a limited amount of time, so we were not going to survey the entire seabed. We were going to find each obstruction. If it wasn't right at the position the fishermen had give us, we'd search the area around it for maybe a square mile or two, and determine what it was, what that obstruction is. Over the next 6 years, we used sonar systems, and we surveyed blocks of seabed, looking at each obstruction. We found dozens more shipwrecks, most of them small, less than 90 feet. Some of them beaten down badly, so there's very little left but an engine block, perhaps a 40 or 50-foot vessel that sank 10 or 20 years ago. The Portland had a substantial amount of iron in their construction, so we also used magnetometers, which don't give us an image of the seabed, but they sense disturbances in the Earth's magnetic field based on the presence of ferrous metals. The walking beam on the Portland, I believe, weighed 22 tons, and that's quite a bit of iron. Even if it's in deep water, we'd be able to know that something fairly substantial was there. Occasionally, when we had a target that didn't really look identifiable acoustically on sonar, but had some iron, we'd deploy underwater video systems that were manufactured locally. They were donated for the effort, and high-powered 1,000-watt lighting systems so that we could get video of the target on the bottom to determine what it was. Over that 6-year period, we didn't have winches and we didn't have large boats, and some of the water we worked in was very deep. So all the cable had to be pulled by hand. The instruments aren't very heavy, but the cable is, and the more cable that gets in the water, the heavier it gets for the guy hauling it. So there were a lot of calories burned in those 6 years. And at the end of 6 years, we found that we had mapped out all the obstructions here, through here, following Dick's suggested path. We didn't jump to the 10-hour point right away because we didn't know that those watches had stopped from immersion, and there was a 41-minute difference between all of them. Worked our way all the way up here until we finally located the Portland here. Comparing the location of the shipwreck and the last known location of the sighting, it turns out that Captain Blanchard didn't move at all night. And since then, I've talked to captains that have been in Patagonia and Antarctica in bad storms, and they tell me they just point the ship into the sea and just wait. They just jog into the sea, try to hold position so they don't get blown on a lee shore, and they just try to wait that storm out. And that's exactly what Blanchard did. The shipwreck is very close to the last sighted position. Now, these positions also came from schooners that were in blinding snowstorms coming back in from the banks. How close they knew where they were, although they were very good, we don't know. So these are kind of rough positions. But he didn't go very far that night. And actually, in bringing this to a little bit of a close, we weren't the first to find the Portland. We know from looking at the wreck and the number of nets that are on the wreck that many, many fishermen found the Portland before we did. They didn't know what it was, but they didn't want to ever go back there because they'd lost their equipment. We just put a name on it. And anticlimactically, we weren't the first ones to do that either. 3 months after the Portland sank, she was located by fishermen. In March of 1899, 2 vessels. Captain John McKenney of the Mary Cabral was the first, and he hauled up parts that he was sure from the steamer, and he had it pinpointed pretty well. He was firm in his opinion that he'd located it. and the position is pretty close. In those days of positions on newspapers, he had located that vessel. Another vessel 3 weeks later went out called the Maud S. And I believe that since the Maud S was one of those schooners, it was the last to see the Portland, that the captain of the Maud S went to locate it. He went on a search based on McKinney's information. And he did find it. He brought up bed frames. He brought up the sounding lead, which was amazing. Electric light fixtures. This is, again, is just a little over 3 months after she went down. This bed frame was taken to Carpenter in Bath, Maine, and he said, oh, that modification right there, or I'm not sure which one it was, we couldn't get these bed frames to fit. I had to modify these. That's my work. So it was positively identified by him, and his position is fairly accurate as well. So it is a little anticlimactic, but the work that's been done by the sanctuary people this year is incredibly revealing. We didn't get any kind of data like this. It's deep water. We have very poor sonar records. We have poor video of lots of anemones. The sanctuary went to great lengths this year to get good information and good imagery of this wreck. In this side scan pass, they have smokestacks and the walking beam. We just knew that we had a ship that had machinery high enough to be the Portland, and that the length of the ship was long enough. They even took horizontal photography, which we didn't get much of, and actually went into some parts of the ship. Is Dr. McDonald still here? Is that the pintle and the gudgeon of the rudder? The rudder assembly, which is a tough place to get to if you're using a remotely operated vehicle because of the risk of hang-up. You have to get in under the vessel, and if there's nets above, it could cause a loss of equipment. They've got some stunning images, and I think those images are probably part of a whole other presentation that NOAA will be doing at some point, and it will be of great interest. In the 1990s, after we'd located the Portland, work got in our way. Our summer hobby time began to deteriorate rapidly. We did a little bit more shipwreck work, but we didn't look for very many more shipwrecks after that because things kept cropping up and people kept asking us to go do things that took a lot of our time. In the 1991, 2 commuter aircraft crashes. We were requested to come in, locate them, and help salvage those. In 1992 and 3, Boeing and the Taiwanese government asked us to come and locate 2 747 engines that departed an aircraft at 8,000 feet. In 1993 and 4, we had a 13-month project to locate 60 tons of sodium cyanide that had fallen off a freighter in the deep Pacific off the coast of Valparaiso, Chile. It was a tough operation because 10 containers fell off and only 3 were full of cyanide. The rest were empty. We were asked by Lloyd's of London to find all 10 of them. In 1996, TWA Flight 100 took a lot of our time working with the NTSP in getting the pieces off the bottom or locating the pieces to that accident. And throughout the late 90s, we spent a lot of time working in the granite rail quarry for the Norfolk County DA's office, putting remote sensing instrumentation looking for targets within the quarry. We did that before they drained it and after they drained it. You can see the reeds in the background here. You can see them in the next picture that shows what it looked like after they drained it. It was a very difficult environment to work in. There are the reeds there. This is drained. It was 250 feet deep. That's a car. That's another car. And there were just dozens of cars. Our ROV operator would slide in under an overhang, and I'd say, "What's above you?" And he'd tilt his camera back and look, and there'd be a Jeep Cherokee hanging by one wheel. So it was a tough environment to work in, and we went back there a number of times for the DA's office. They were great guys to work with. In 1998, we were called back to Taiwan on a Saab 340 commuter aircraft crash, recovered the data recorders, and helped them finish that investigation and find causal factors. And just this year, we were in Dalian, China, Arnie Carr, helping recover black boxes from an MD-82 that went in, and just 3 weeks later, a 747 came apart at 33,000 feet in Taiwan, and we were asked to go over there, and we spent most of the summer on that data. It's interesting, in China and Taiwan, they don't need to have lots of hydraulics. That's a big, heavy spool of cable. They just call 10 more guys. That's great. A lot of people transport things. Just a thought on what Captain Blanchard might have been thinking during that night in the storm as the waves were tearing away at his ship. This is a picture of the Katahdin. She was a smaller steamer of 1,234 tons that made the Maine Boston route earlier than the Portland. And in 1866, she went out of Rockland, Maine, into the teeth of a storm very similar. And as the captain got offshore, the waves got bigger and bigger, and he didn't want to turn around or try to go to shore for a fear of getting blown onto a lee shore. Just going to look at some notes. It was January 8th. It was cloudy when he left, but he went right into that storm. At 1 a.m., the seas began to smash the vessel and carried away the sides of the vessel, the bulwarks that are above the main deck, and washed a lot of the freight right off the ship. Water entered the coal bunkers and flooded them, and the captain knew that if he fell broadside to the sea, his ship was doomed for shore. The crew began to burn what freight was left to keep steam up. After that, they began to burn parts of the furniture, benches, bed frames. When that was gone, they started burning parts of the ship herself. The captain just barely limped into Portsmouth, New Hampshire with enough steam to get there. But you can see the damage here where the sea had washed this whole bulwarks away, and they were actually burning some of the sides here that hadn't been washed away just to keep steam up. And I hear they even burned a cargo of ham to keep steam in the boilers. And I'm sure Blanchard was thinking of that and hoping to be able to make it through the night in the storm. That pretty much wraps up the 12 years that we spent looking for it, and I'd like to commend the Sanctuary on the work that they've done to document this and map it, and I expect they'll be doing a lot more interesting work on the site. That's a very good question. The question was, it was clear that in 1899 there were some very accurate positions on where the Portland was. What took us so long? We'd never looked 6 months or 3 months after the Portland sank into the newspapers, and there were lots of little reports. We had seen that report in a couple of sentences in someone's book that it was secondary research. We wanted primary research. And we didn't look when things stopped coming ashore from the Portland. We didn't look at the papers. We did find that once we were there. Somebody said to us, "You guys are looking way up north." Well, you know, there's a report. So we went to the newspapers, and there it was. So we hadn't researched it thoroughly enough. That's right. Any other? Yep. It was side-scan sonar that gave us our first image of it. We actually, once we had that image, we did not use a magnetometer on it. We just used magnetometer in search operations.
When the parts of the ship started coming to shore and the ship was breaking up, what time frame do you think there was between when those parts fell off the ship and when the ship actually sank?
The question was, what was the time frame between when the ship began to break up and the ship sank? I think it was probably catastrophic. One of the last sightings of these schooners, as it was in the bay in the evening, said that the Portland, if it was the Portland, had her lights out. So something had probably come apart inside the ship. But I think probably it was fairly catastrophic, maybe 15 or 20 minutes of pounding. And possibly if the ship did lose steam and turn broadside to the sea, it would be much less than that. The combers and the waves would just sweep everything off those decks, cabins, everything.
So it wasn't a fact of holding ground on the wounded ship, probably.
Yeah, did he hold ground with the wounded ship? Probably we'll never know that. It's just an estimate on my part. I'm sure there was some damage as he worked through the night, and I think the end probably came fairly quickly. In the back? Where was she built? The ship was built in Bath, Maine. And there were several schooners I think you could see to the side. It was a very active shipbuilding area in Bath, Maine on the Kennebec River. Sorry? Bath Iron Works did not build it. I think Bath had something to do with the boilers and machinery, but it doesn't. It's not at the tip of my tongue as to what company built it, but I don't think it was Percy and Small, and it was not Bath. There's not much question in my mind because there was one or two other ocean-going paddle wheel walking beam steamers that either left England or left Boston and were never seen again. The dimensions of this vessel match the location is really what tells us. There are ships of that size, but no other steamships of that size within miles of this location. And based on those watches and the predictions that Dick has given us and the fit of the photographs, the stern bits, seems to fit like a glove. Is there a chance it's not the Portland? Very, very slim, I'd say. She's in deep water, 400 to 500 feet.
Is there any chance that some submersible work with, I imagine that was an ROV that took those pictures.
Right.
Is there any pitch right now to have a manned submersible down?
NOAA has a lot of resources, and this is quite a find. Dr. Moon, do you want to answer that? I'm sure there is, in the next year or two, there are going to be ROV efforts and.
One of the concerns is so many hands on the vessel. It's very reluctant to put manned vehicles down there. The expensive consideration, the logical consideration at the moment is the risk of the hangar.
So there might be more ROV operations or that sort of thing, yeah.
The additional slides sonar profile, to get a better understanding where those hangs are, and then apply the ROV profile once we have a better understanding of that setup. I might add, John, when you indicated that giving that the rudder a shot is very tricky. We actually did hang up the ROV for 3 hours, and we're in some jeopardy with a stretch of gill that which ran right above that picture. So shortly after we took that, we almost stopped operations in the summer.
Yeah, and that's an expensive piece of equipment to lose. We might be able to work together, our group with NOAA, and get vertical, do a mosaic of the whole wreck. That would be a fascinating product of this. Yes, she was basically a wooden constructed vessel with an iron strap around her, which was fairly small compared with the height. So there is quite a bit of wood above, all the way to the main deck. It's got missing planks, but virtually the hull is there. Were the bodies wearing life jackets? Many of them were. Many of them were wearing life jackets. Yes. The question is, what could the captain have done to avoid that storm? One thing that's always impressed me is the ability of sea captains to look at particularly the older ones, to look at the sky and feel the wind and feel the density of the air and the moisture in it and have a pretty good idea what's going to happen in the next 24 hours. Hollis Blanchard was a younger fellow who might not have had that experience, but it's uncanny if you spend any time around even fishing vessel of a length of only 100 feet, captains, how much they can tell about what's going to happen. And their livelihood, their vessel, and even their lives depend on them understanding the weather. And I think there are some rules that people can study and look at the sky and the wind and the weather. If a wind is shifting towards the west or it's shifting towards the east and a storm's coming, which direction you have to go to avoid that storm. There are now rules. And I think a captain, once he's in weather like that, would have no choice but to not be able to turn around. And the sea gets as high as it probably got that night, he couldn't turn around. He could simply work his way into it. But could he have told beforehand? I think his daughter had a coming out party on Monday. Maybe some extenuating circumstances. I study a lot of aircraft accidents, large aircraft accidents, and they talk about cockpit resource management. What was going on in the captain's mind? Why did he not do this? Did he have other extenuating circumstances? So there are so many things we won't know, but in general, captains are very good at avoiding bad weather. Yeah, that's right. In 1938, the hurricane wasn't predicted well either, but I wonder if some experienced ship captains had a feeling something was going to happen. Okay, well, thank you.